yesterday. I did not get to hear all the lessons. There are USB drives in the back that have all of my PowerPoint slides, as well as many more lessons that I will not be able to cover here this weekend. We're continuing our theme dealing with issues of the world. We discussed on Friday evening all the major issues that we're battling today, whether it be the LGBT movement, abortion, racism, climate change, extreme environmentalism. All these things that we hear in the political realm actually have roots tying back to the Enlightenment. And it was the Enlightenment that ultimately gave rise to the idea of naturalism, the idea that we only explain what we see through nature and not through God or a supernatural explanation. And that ultimately gave rise to the departure from Genesis. And ultimately that gave rise to Charles Darwin, which fueled all of the major issues we're dealing with today. I'll briefly cover some of that history this morning, but we're mainly going to be focusing on the pillars that the scientific, secular, and academic community uses to justify and prop up this idea of evolution. And we're going to seek to dismantle those pillars this morning. Charles Darwin was born in 1809, originally grew up in a religious home, started to study medicine following in his father's footsteps. He realized, however, he was squeamish and could not handle blood, and so he changed his education to divinity. But along the way, he met some friends who were also naturalists, and they were going to go on a voyage on the HMS Beagle. It was going to be a 5-year voyage in which they would travel around the world. And particularly, they were going to travel around the Galapagos Islands. In one of the books that Charles Darwin took with him was a book written by Charles Lyell called Principles of Geology. And Charles Lyell is the one that we credit with popularizing the idea of uniformitarianism. The idea that the present is the key to the past, which is a fundamental principle in many of the dating methods used today that gives us millions or billions of years for the Earth and the universe. And so ultimately, Charles Darwin was influenced by Charles Lyell to think in terms of long ages, and that's how he was able to come up with his ideas on evolution. He said as much in a letter. He said, "I always feel as if my books came half out of Lyell's brains, and I never acknowledge this sufficiently. Nor do I know how I can without saying so in so many words. For I've always thought the great merit of the principles of geology was that it altered the whole tone of one's mind, and therefore that when seeing a thing never seen by Lyell, one yet saw it partially through his eyes." So in 1859, Charles Darwin published his famous book on the origin of species. And we mentioned that there's a subtitle of this book, The Preservation of Favored Races and the Struggle for Life. And that Darwin himself indeed was a racist, and many of his ideas promoted racism. But ultimately in this book, what he was arguing was two fundamental ideas. First idea is natural selection. That is, nature selects that which is fittest to survive. So the second idea being survival of the fittest. And he illustrated this with some finches that he saw on the Galapagos Islands. What he noted was that on some islands you would see finches who may have larger beaks, and on some islands you would see finches with smaller beaks. And finches with smaller beaks may be more equipped to open certain seeds and certain nuts to eat. And if they could eat, they could live and they could reproduce their population. But on other islands you would see birds with bigger beaks, and maybe they were more adapted for eating certain worms. And so that gave them an advantage in their environment. But the problem is, a finch is still a finch, and it never changes from being a finch or from being a bird. And this is where the idea of long periods of time has to come in to suggest that small, gradual changes over many millions of years can add up to big changes. And so there have been several icons of evolution, evidences to support evolution over the years. In fact, many of these are still used in high school and college textbooks, even though many evolutionists, skeptics, and atheists have recognized that these, in some cases, are fraudulent, or at best, just bad examples. For example, in the top left corner, those are Ernest Haeckel's drawings. They were all forged, and Darwin even argued this point in his second book to say, if we look at embryos from the very early stages, they all look very much alike, arguing that they had a common ancestor. Well, in fact, they don't look anything alike. Middle one at the top, that's Lucy, an alleged missing link. There have been many of these. If you go to museums, you'll see a small handful of bones, and yet they're always able to reproduce these life-size replicas. Fascinating drawings in textbooks. And yet as you start to examine all these missing links, they all have flaws, all have holes, and that's why the missing link is still missing. Archaeopteryx, homology, peppered moths. I even had the peppered moths used in one of my college classes. That was another forged example, but also not a very good example in supporting Darwin's claims. There was actually one icon that Charles Darwin drew in his book, or from his notes to the Galapagos Island. It was this idea of this tree of life, where we all come from a common ancestor, and from there we start from a simple single-celled organism, and we develop into this complex tree of life. And we noted that in the geological column, it doesn't look like this at all. In fact, famous Harvard paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould spent his entire career trying to make sense of the fossil record as it relates to evolution, because the fossil record looks nothing like this. But around the middle 1900s, late 1800s, people started to realize that Darwinian evolution was insufficient. And it was French evolutionary botanist Hugo de Vries who said, natural selection may explain the survival of the fittest, but it cannot explain the arrival of the fittest. In other words, if I start with something simple cell, how do I go from a small amount of information in its genome to a complex amount of genome today in the human being? And so this is what introduced the neo-Darwinian synthesis, or the evolutionary mechanism to explain how we get the changes. And the idea is mutations are what give us the changes needed for natural selection to act upon. So college textbooks summed it up this way. It says changes in DNA are behind the phenotypic variations that are the raw material in which natural selection has acted for billions of years to drive evolution. The wide-ranging variation in genetic makeup of the human population and other populations as well is in fact the result of a balance between continuous introduction of new mutations. So those are the two pillars that I mentioned: mutations and long periods of time. We have small mutations every time we reproduce, and if we do that for millions of years, maybe we can get from a simple single-celled organism through all the life we see today, all the way up to mankind. That's what evolution proposes. And of course, they would say, we don't really see this happening today. As Richard Dawkins would note, we're condemned to live only for a few decades, and that's too slow, too small a time scale to see evolution going on. So evolution hangs on two pillars: time and the mechanism of mutations. And if we were to knock either one of those pillars out, the entire theory would collapse, because those two pillars are dependent upon each other. But what our aim is this morning is to knock both pillars out and allow the theory of evolution to crumble. Before we jump into the mechanism in time, I'll play a short video for you this morning. Because when I entered one of my introductory biology classes in college, I had an evolutionary professor who got up on one of the first days of class and he wrote on the board, 98% of all life scientists accept that evolution is a fact. So all you Christians out there who believe the earth is young and evolution is not true, you need to get over it, because you're wrong. It is a fact. But the reality is, as more and more scientists have studied in their respective disciplines, more and more scientists, not necessarily Christians, not necessarily even those who believe in God, but more and more are calling into question evolution because it simply is not meshing with the data.
I'm skeptical of
We are skeptical of claims for the ability of random mutations
and natural selection
to account for the complexity of life.
careful examination of the evidence
For Darwinian theory should be encouraged. I'm skeptical of claims for the ability ability of random mutation
and natural selection
to account for the complexity of life. Careful examination
of the evidence for the theory
should be encouraged.
And so don't always buy into the claims the media will sometimes throw at you, which is an appeal to an authority. It's a logical fallacy. Just because so-and-so has such and such degree does not make whatever they say true or correct. Let's start with a mechanism. We're going to start with the first problem with the mechanism of mutations as it relates to evolution, and what we'll call genetic entropy. And I'm going to explain genetic entropy to start at a high level. But imagine we had a picture of a monkey, and we took that picture of a monkey and we were to make a copy of it. We took it to the printer and we reproduced it. And we continued that process where we would take the printed copy that we just produced and then we would reproduce that copy. And we would do that over and over and over again. Well, what you would start to see over time is degradation. You would start to see some fuzziness appear in that picture of that monkey. And the more we did it, the fuzzier and fuzzier it would get until we could no longer tell that it even was a monkey. Now, you would think someone would be crazy to suggest that they can do this type of process and eventually come up with a clear picture of a man. But that, in fact, is what evolution is suggesting. That through mutations over a long period of time, we can go from simple to even more complex and more intricate. So what is entropy? Something we're all familiar with. At a very high, simple level, things tend to break down and wear out over time. If we set a tractor out in the field or an old truck out in the field, it doesn't get better over time. It starts to rust, it starts to deteriorate, it starts to break down. Things are always at their best at their origin, when they start. We see this with cars over time, they break down. We see it in the natural world. You have a log. Over time, it's either going to decompose or you may burn it. But it always goes from a state of more usable energy to a state of less usable energy, from a state of order to a state of disorder. The same is true for human beings. The same is true for when we reproduce. And so we understand that every human being is comprised of a genome, of a very complex array of coding, if you will. You've seen that model of the double helix, those DNA strands. And inside a DNA strand, there's 4 letters, A, T, C, G. And the arrangement of those letters will tell you how tall you'll be, what your hair color will be, what your eye color will be. And everyone's DNA is unique. We wrap all that DNA together to eventually form chromosomes. And at conception, you receive 23 from the mother, 23 from the father, 46 total, forming 23 pairs. And that's all the genetic information that will describe you. In total, there's about 2 sets of 3 billion letters each. If you were to try to understand this like a computer program, computer code, we don't actually have a good analogy. You see, because the human genome isn't like a code that's written left to right, that we read each letter at a time and we say, okay, blue eyes, black hair, 6 feet tall. That's not how it works. Rather, the DNA is like a sentence that you read left to right, and that's one set of instructions. You then read it right to left, and it's a new set of instructions. You then read every other word, and that's a third set of instructions. Not only that, but we actually take that code, and in the 3-dimensional world, we fold it up into a 3-dimensional structure shape that gives a new set of information. And not only that, in time, or 4th dimension, it will change shape to give another set of information. We don't have anything remotely close to be able to explain how complex and dynamic DNA really is. We're going to attempt to create an analogy to show what the evolution is really saying when they say we go from a simple single-cell organism to the complex human genome today. We're going to do that by starting with a little red wagon. Something I'm sure many of us played with as a kid. And you probably didn't pay attention when you got the red wagon, but it probably came with an instruction manual. Told you how to assemble the wheels and assemble the handle and what not to do, some safety precautions. But if we were going to have a manual that told us how to construct that little red wagon, how to create and formulate the metal, how to create the rubber on the tires, how to create the paint to coat it, well, that would probably be a rather thick book. Well, let's step it up one notch in complexity. Let's think about a car. Now, cars are complex, and I'm thankful for those mechanics who know how to operate on an engine, how to fix certain parts when things break. But I'm also thankful it comes with an instruction manual that tells me when this light comes on, it's time for me to take it to a specialist. But if I was going to look at a set of instructions that told me how to manufacture and make that car, it's probably something on the size or greater than an encyclopedia set. How do I make the engine? How do I make the lights? How do I make all those intricate electronics and technology that goes into the car, all those safety features? And so that would be a much larger set of information. Well, what about if we wanted to create a spaceship? Well, now we're probably talking about the Library of Congress. The amount of information that would go in to creating and building a spaceship that could go into outer space and perhaps reach the moon. And so at the very fundamental, we start with words. Words are like that ATCG, those letters that formulate the base nucleotides in the DNA double helix. We use words to construct sentences, that then construct large books, and then construct large volumes of encyclopedias, that ultimately then reach to libraries. And that's like going from the nucleotides all the way up to that 3 billion letter set we call the human genome. And what the evolutionists are suggesting is that we can start with words, and we can start to randomly change them. And if we throw enough time at it, we're eventually going to have the Library of Congress. And it's going to make that much sense. So let's talk about the types of mutations that actually can occur. We have an original sentence up there, the big red dog. And one of the things that can happen in mutation is we can lose information. In fact, it's much more common to lose information than to ever gain information. And so you could delete something. We go from the big red dog to the red dog. Does that help us in going from simple life to more complex life? No. We could have an insertion where we now have the big fat red dog. But as most times, insertions are not helpful either. You can also have an inversion, the big red God. We switch the letters for dog to God. Most of the time, that's very harmful. We can have a duplication, the big red dog. That's more information, but not helpful information. And we have translocation. That doesn't give us more information either. And so can this evolutionary mechanism that the evolutionists suggest, can it take us from the simple single-celled organism all the way to a complex human being? Much like, can we start with a little red wagon and set of instructions, and just randomly mutate that all the way to the point that we can now create a spaceship? That, in effect, is what the evolutionist is suggesting. And so let's go through a test scenario, and let's play this out. We'll call this our genetic entropy assembly line. And we'll start with the transcriber. This is the individual who's going to take that set of instructions. He's going to then feed it to the assembly line that's going to follow those instructions. And then whatever pops out will be seen by the quality control technician. This is like our natural selection, observing what comes out on the end. And if something comes out on the end that's not good enough, he's going to say, away with it. If something comes out on the end that's what he's expecting or better, he'll say, great, it passes. And it'll come back to the transcriber. So we start with the instruction manual. It goes to the assembly line. Out pops that same instruction manual plus the little red wagon. The quality control technician says this is a good wagon. We send that instruction manual back to the transcriber who then makes a new copy. If we repeated this process for millions of years, would that little booklet that explained how to build that little red wagon ever take us to a spaceship? Does that seem plausible? Does that seem feasible? But that, in fact, is what the evolutionist is suggesting. And I believe when you can paint it this simply, for most evolutionists or people who are questioning, they realize, quite frankly, how silly this entire idea is. Dr. John Sanford, he was a former evolutionist, a former atheist. He was one of the inventors of the gene gun. And it was through his own work that he rejected evolution and rejected atheism. And here's what he had to say. He said, the specified complexity in the simplest form of life is arguably greater than that of a space shuttle. Try to absorb the fact that the jump in complexity from a bacterium to a human being is arguably greater than the jump from the little red wagon to the space shuttle. There is simply no human technology that serves as an adequate analogy for the complexity of a human being. The genome is the instruction manual encoding all the information needed for that human life. It's a reality that little red wagon over time simply turns into a less usable, more degraded state, not a more usable state. I'll summarize this just by saying that most mutations, over 99%, fall in the harmful category. They actually degrade and destroy information. They don't add new, meaningful, or helpful information. In the very, very rare exception where you do have beneficial mutations, what's actually occurring is, for example, in some crops. A crop may produce some sort of aroma that attracts, say, a locust, and if they were going there and turn that off, well, they deleted information. It took information away, but it may stop the locust from being attracted to that crop. That does not help us in the grand scheme of the evolutionary ideology. And we actually see this just within ourselves. This is eventually why we grow old and why we die, because our skin, our anatomy, is constantly reproducing. It's replacing itself. Every time it does, mutations are introduced. But you typically don't see people improving over time, right? You see people starting to wear down, get some wrinkles, get some gray hair, can't move as fast as they once did, and that's because that nucleus starts to degrade. And it's eventually why we die out. And so again, imagine that every time we reproduce, we're adding 100 to 200 of these mutations. What happens over time? We're actually building up mutations in the human population. This is counterintuitive to what evolution would suggest or what evolution would require. Moving on to engineered adaptability. We're all familiar with simple engineered systems such as a smoke detector. We realize that when smoke detectors have smoke enter into their vents, they are programmed to then sound a siren. It's a simple if-then statement that if the smoke detector detects smoke, then the alarm sounds. And this is very similar to how much of human engineering, human coding, and programming goes. But as it turns out, as we've studied the human DNA more and different animals' DNA, it has similar features, which is counterintuitive to evolution. Let me illustrate this with the blind cavefish. You go down into some caves, you'll find fish that have lost their eyesight completely. In fact, a lot of times they don't even have eyes, their sockets are just closed. And what the evolutionists would suggest is, well, look, after being down here for millions of years, they lost that eyesight and were able to enhance other features, and that was through evolutionary. They were more fit, so they were the ones that survived and eventually lost that eyesight. Well, that's actually not what's happening with blind cavefish. Dr. Jeff Tompkins, geneticist at ICR, said the following: as it turns out, the repression of eye development in cavefish is simply part of an overall strategy to conserve energy in dark and nutrient-deficient caves. In blind cavefish, eye development gets repressed and chemical pressure and touch sense organs get enhanced. Manufacturing and maintaining eyes in individual centers of the brain requires and consumes large amounts of resources and energy. This drain on metabolic resources in a cave environment is elevated when the eyes are inhibited from developing in young fish embryos. So here's what actually happens. If you take those blind cavefish, you reintroduce them to the surface where you have light, within about 1 or 2 generations, those eyes come right back, because now they're helpful, now they're useful. You take the fish with eyes, put them down in a cave, 1 or 2 generations, now the eyesight is gone again. Well, what is that evidence of? That's not evidence of random mutations in natural selection. That's evidence of a designer. That's just like what we see in engineered systems today. So if we can look at a smoke detector and realize, wow, that's engineered, there's intelligence behind that. When we look at the animals and the human beings, we see that we're also engineered. And we're engineered in such a way as to respond to our environment. That's evidence of God's handiwork, not evidence of random mutations and natural selection. Third line of argument is irreducible complexity. This was a term coined by geneticist Michael Behe in 1996. In fact, it was Charles Darwin who said of origin of the species, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed, which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. And so to illustrate this, Michael Behe used this simple mousetrap. Mousetrap has about 5 components to it, and the purpose is to catch a mouse. But if you remove any one of those components, it can no longer catch the mouse. And so how would you evolve a system like this? How do you bring all of these integral parts together simultaneously? This would certainly be a problem for evolution. He used several examples, particularly the bacteria flagellum. And what the bacteria flagellum is, it's a little motor, it's like a little tail on the end of a bacteria, such as E. coli and sperm cells, and it allows that little bacteria to swim around. And if you start to study that bacteria flagellum, you see it has many intricate parts, and if we were to remove any one of those intricate parts, the whole thing stops working. And you can no longer swim around. In fact, Dr. Dudley Burridge, microbiologist, he described it like this. He said, like an electrical motor, the flagellum contains a rod, or drive shaft, a hook, or universal joint, L and P rings, bushings and bearings, S and N rings, a rotor, and a C ring, or stud, like a stator. The flagellar filament, like a propeller, is attached to the flagellar motor via the hook. To function completely, the flagellum requires over 40 different proteins. Electrical power for driving motor is supplied by the voltage difference developed across the cell plasma membrane. So in other words, it's just like an engine, a motor. Allows it to swim around. And if we were to pull out any one of the integral pieces, it's going to shut down. The bacteria would pass away, would die, cannot live. And so what evolutionists have tried to say is, well, if I see this set of parts within the bacteria flagellum, and I can find it used in another system, maybe that's how it could have evolved. But the problem with all these arguments is they're hand-waving arguments. They can never show a clear path for how something could evolve, say, like the eye. They simply see some worms that they basically have photosensitive sites where they can tell if it's light or dark, but they can't see anything. And they just assume that because something looks kind of similar over here, it could somehow get to something very complex over here. But the pathway or step between those two is always just a hand wave. It's similar to the type of arguments used in homology, where evolution will say, if you look at a human skeleton, if you look at the hand, for example, and you compare that skeleton structure with a cat, or a bat, or a dolphin, or a horse, there's similarities. But that could be argued hand-waving whether that's a common descent or a common designer. For example, if you look at the automation in the automotive industry, and for example, if you like Fords, and you buy a Ford Edge versus a F-150, well, it's two different types of vehicles. They're not really related, yet they have very similar features because they come from the same manufacturer. They're all going to have tires, they're all going to have doors, but they're all designed to function on the same road. That's why we have similarities. And so it can be argued just as well from a creation standpoint that the reason why we see all the similarities is because God designed us to operate and live in the same place, the same environment, the same world. But again, we cannot make the jump from the little red wagon or a bicycle up to an 18-wheeler with just a hand-waving argument. We actually have to show how we could get there. And it turns out there are many examples of irreducibly complex systems. The human eye, other bacteria filaments that are used for movement, cellular respiration, photosynthesis. Just think about our own anatomy for a second. You know, inside our stomachs, we have gastric acid. Whenever you throw up a little bit in the back of your throat, you have that burning sensation. Well, how are we able to formulate that gastric acid when if we allowed it to get out to the rest of our body, it would actually harm us very bad? And so which came first? The ability to consume food, using our mouth to eat the food, or the rest of our digestive tract needed to decompose that food and turn it into nutrients. So these are irreducibly complex systems. Additionally, we have biological mutualism or symbiosis. This is a relatively simple concept. You're probably familiar with some of these. But this is where you have two different organisms, two different animals that are dependent on each other for survival. If you take away one, how does the other survive? Well, if you have to have both, how do you evolve two systems simultaneously that can support each other? I'll give you one quick example of the yucca moth and the yucca plant. It turns out that the yucca moth needs the yucca plant, and the yucca plant needs the yucca moth. The yucca moth is needed to fertilize and pollinate the plant so that it can reproduce. But the yucca moth also places its eggs inside of the yucca plant. And when its offspring are hatched, they feed on the yucca plant as their early nutrition. But the yucca moth knows not to eat all of the plant so that the cycle can continue. How do you evolve such a system? If you remove the yucca moth, the yucca plant dies. If you remove the yucca plant, the yucca moth dies. And there are many examples of this in nature. So hopefully now we have destroyed the pillar of the mechanism. We've shown that it really only exists in the imagination of the evolutionists and in textbooks. And there really is no support to be offered for it. But what about time? Now, we dealt with time yesterday, and we gave explanations for several of the arguments, such as radiometric dating and distant starlight, and the assumptions used behind those dating methods. And we noted that most dating methods actually give a relatively young age for the Earth. They don't give millions or billions of years. But it's interesting to note that there are simple probability statistics that can be done that show it doesn't matter how much time we allow for evolution. We could literally double or triple the age of the universe, say up to north of 30 trillion years, and that still wouldn't be enough time for evolution to produce even the simplest life forms in their ideal scenarios. Dr. John Baumgartner, he said the following: many evolutionists are persuaded that the 15 billion years they assume for the age of the cosmos is an abundance of time for random interactions of atoms and molecules to generate life. A simple arithmetic lesson reveals this to be no more than irrational fantasy. So I won't go through the weeds of this argument too much here, but in short, what is assumed is if we were to say how many times have atoms in the universe collided with each other over 30 billion years, that's probably a pretty good statistical amount for the number of interactions that could occur. Well, if the probability for that occurring, how many times that would occur, is less than the probability to produce simple life, the simplest life we see on Earth, then evolution wouldn't even be probable. It would be impossible. And so that's exactly what is done here. And eventually what you get is a number of 10 to the power 110. So 10 with 110 zeros behind it. That would be the total number of interatomic collisions, atoms hitting each other in the universe for over 30 billion years. But the likelihood of creating a simple functioning protein is 10 to the 130th power. That is 10 with 130 zeros behind it. And so as Sir Frederick Hoyle noted, the chance that higher forms have emerged in this way is comparable with the chance that a tornado sweeping through a junkyard might assemble a Boeing 747 from the materials therein. Let me also give some examples of a young Earth from biological arguments. The first one ties in what we were just talking about with genetic entropy, and it deals with the degradation of the human genome. You see, evolutionists have understood that if human beings, as they suppose, have been around for around 3 million years, we would have added many mutations into our gene pool. And if it had been 3 million years, the question has been proposed, why has the human population not been so degraded that we've died out 100 times over? And so what John Stanford did in his research was he started to look at the mathematical curves that explain how fast these mutations accumulate. And then he started to look at how many mutations we've accumulated to present. And he started to extrapolate backwards, and what he found was that the human population couldn't have been more than 1 million years old, for one. But number two, to explain the current amount of mutations we have today, it takes us roughly back about 6,000 to 10,000 years ago. And so he actually converted. He's now not an evolutionist, not an atheist, but a young Earth creationist. And what was interesting from his research in explaining that mathematical curve Well, see, when we took all of those ages we read in Genesis, and Methuselah living over 900 years old, so-and-so begot so-and-so and lived for several hundred years. And what he did, we started plotting those ages over time, and we saw those ages match up exactly with the same mathematical curve that he came up with in his study of mutations. And so the question was asked yesterday, how are people able to live so long? Was it due to their environment? Well, perhaps they probably had a more pristine environment, but I think an even better explanation, or more thorough explanation, is to understand very simply, when are things at its best? When they're first created, at their origin. And so human beings at that time would have been at their peak, but over time, as mutations were entered in after the fall, after reproducing, they naturally would have started to degrade. Now, I usually get asked the follow-up question, well, why is it that people 100 years ago didn't live as long as people today? Well, there's several reasons. Number one, our environment is much easier today. When you go to other parts of the world, people are still living to 40s and 50s, maybe 30s. But they also have very poor living standards. They don't have enough power or electricity to even power a refrigerator for a year. And so they don't have access to the same nutrition that we do. They don't have access to the same health care that we do. But it's interesting to note here in recent years, we've actually seen that average lifespan starting to peak out. It was growing. It started to peak out, and now started slightly declining again here in the United States and the developed worlds. Another example of not enough time from biology is ancient microbe resurrection. Jeffrey Tompkins, he noted the following. Since the mid-1990s, scientists have isolated and characterized more than 1,200 ancient microorganisms extracted from fossils found in amber. These amber fossil finds include 9 ancient yeasts, 4 of which are brewer's yeast, that were presented and used to commercially brew beer by one of the scientists who discovered them. These amber extracts microbes were thought to be up to 40 million years old. It says the most amazing microbe discovery came when scientists were able to revive bacteria extracted from salt inclusions in rock strata that were alleged to be 250 million years old. Based on an evolutionary perspective of the rock strata, scientists dated the salt inclusion layers as early Triassic. Needless to say, these ancient resurrected microbes shouldn't have been present if the rocks were actually that old. Their existence points to a young Earth and a recent global flood. So you think small bacteria are living organisms, yet these are able to be resurrected and used to, in one case, make a brewer's yeast. But they are in rocks from an evolutionary perspective that are thought to be over 250 million years old. We'll look at a similar line of argument this afternoon when we talk about dinosaurs in the Bible. The last article we'll look at as it relates to time is population growth. I'll play a short video here. video is a few years old. We're over 8 billion population now. But it's a simple argument. You look at how fast do humans reproduce, how fast do we double and expand. And the two things we observed is that extrapolating backwards, we don't make it more than a couple of thousand years before our population starts to die out with reasonable assumptions. And secondly, where is all the evidence for all of mankind that should have been existing for the last 3 or so million years according to evolutionary timescale? We simply don't see the archaeological evidence to support that. So a quick recap. We have observed the mechanism. We discussed how genetic entropy things degrade over time, how our genomes, both in humans and animals, are precisely engineered like we would expect from a designer, and that they don't fit the evolutionary model. We know that many of these systems are irreducibly complex. They couldn't have evolved over time. They couldn't have just started from lesser evolved systems to more complex systems. They had to come in immediately like they are. And we know that many systems are codependent on one another. We've also analyzed that there's simply not enough time even to consider evolution, but at the same time, the Earth simply is not millions or billions of years old. The data supports what the Bible says if we take Genesis as true literal history. So from there, we've knocked out both the time and the mechanism, and as a result, we now have a theory in crisis. Again, I encourage you to get a USB stick. I have several resources that I give in there for additional reading. Genetic Entropy by John Sanford, if you want to study more of that. Science versus Evolution from Dr. Jeff Miller, AP. Again, several good websites to go get more information. Apologetics Press, for both scientific apologetics as well as general apologetics. And some denominational resources for creation, Answers in Genesis, Institute for Creation Research, and Creation Ministries International. Thank you for your time and attention, and we'll now prepare for worship hour.